the moment everything falls apart. I'll never forget the look on my daughter's face when her own grandfather shut the door on us. Lily was 8 years old, shivering in the December cold, clutching her backpack after standing on that porch for 2 hours because our keys suddenly didn't work anymore. When I pulled into the driveway of the house I'd sacrificed everything to save, the house where 3 generations of our family had lived, I knew something was terribly wrong. Then my father-in-law came out, not to apologize, not to help, but to deliver words that would haunt me forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. We've all decided you don't live here anymore, Rebecca, he said, his voice cold as the winter air. Nathan and his new family are moving in. The house I'd paid $95,000 to rescue from foreclosure. The house they'd promised would be mine after my husband died. The house where Lily had taken her first steps, where I'd nursed her through pneumonia, where we'd grieved together after losing David. Gone. Just like that. My brother-in-law Nathan stood behind him in the doorway, holding shiny new keys, wearing that same smug expression he'd worn at David's funeral when he'd questioned whether I really understood the family finances. That night, as we sat in my Honda Accord in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, Lily asked me a question that shattered my heart into pieces. "Mommy, why doesn't Grandpa love us anymore?" I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But 3 days later, I discovered something that would change everything. Because what they didn't know was that I had been documenting everything for months. Every conversation, every promise, every lie. What they didn't know was that their greed had left a paper trail that would expose secrets buried for 30 years. This is the story of how I lost everything I thought was mine, and then discovered the truth that would destroy the family I married into forever. You think you know where this is going? You don't. Stay until the end. Because when the snow finally melted that spring, no one was left standing where they started. My name is Rebecca Chin Morrison, and at 34 years old, I thought I understood how cruel the world could be. I'd buried my husband David at 32, raised our daughter alone while working double shifts as a pediatric nurse at Riverside General, and somehow managed to keep us both afloat financially and emotionally. But on that bitter December evening in 2019, I learned that the cruelest betrayals don't come from strangers or fate. They come from the people who sit at your dinner table, who hold your baby when she's born, who promise to take care of you when tragedy strikes. The snow had been falling since noon, the kind of heavy, wet flakes that stick to everything and make driving treacherous. I was finishing my shift in the pediatric ICU when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. At first, I thought it was spam. Then I realized it was from Lily, texting from a stranger's phone. "Mom, I can't get in the house. My key isn't working and nobody's answering the door. I'm really cold." My heart stopped. Lily walked home from Maplewood Elementary every day at 3:15, letting herself into the Morrison family house on Elm Street with the key she'd carried since she was 6. The house had been her safe haven, her constant in a world that had already taken her father from her. The idea of her standing alone in the snow, locked out and scared, made me feel physically sick. I didn't wait for the elevator. I ran down 3 flights of stairs, my scrubs still damp from a 12-hour shift that had included 2 emergency procedures and a code blue that had lasted 40 minutes. My mind raced through possibilities as I drove the familiar route home. Broken lock. Frozen mechanism. Maybe Lily had grabbed the wrong key in her rush to get to school that morning. Anything except what I feared most, that William Morrison, my late husband's father, had finally done what he'd been threatening to do since David's funeral 18 months ago. The drive felt endless. Every red light was torture. Every slow driver ahead of me was an obstacle between me and my daughter. When I finally turned onto Elm Street and saw her small figure huddled on the front porch, her purple backpack dark with melted snow, her lips tinged blue from the cold, something inside me broke completely. "Lily." I called out, abandoning the car in the driveway and running toward her. She turned, and the relief that flooded her face nearly brought me to my knees. "Mommy." I tried and tried, but the door won't open. Mrs. Henderson let me use her phone, but I was scared to leave the porch in case someone came home. I pulled her against me, feeling how cold she was through her winter coat, how her small body was shaking. 2 hours. According to Mrs. Henderson, Lily had been trying to get inside for almost 2 hours, standing in the snow, loyal to the home that was apparently no longer hers. I pulled out my own key, the brass one I'd carried for 7 years, the one that had opened this door thousands of times since David and I moved in after our wedding. I slid it into the lock, and my blood ran cold. It turned, but the door didn't budge. There was resistance, the feeling of something blocking it from the inside. A new deadbolt. A deadbolt I didn't have the key to. That's when the door opened from the inside, and William Morrison stood there, dry and warm in his cardigan and slippers, his gray hair perfectly combed, his reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck. Behind him, I could see Nathan unpacking boxes in what used to be our living room. "William," I said, my voice catching. "What's going on? Why won't our keys work?" "Lily's been standing out here for hours." His pale blue eyes, so much like David's had been, looked at me with something I'd never seen before. Not just dislike or disapproval, but actual hatred. "We've all decided you don't live here anymore, Rebecca," he said, his voice flat and final. "Nathan and his family need the space more than you do. You need to collect your things and go." The world tilted sideways. "What?" "William, this is our home. David's home. You can't just." "The house is in Morrison family hands," he interrupted. "David is gone. You're not a Morrison anymore. Nathan has 3 children. You only have one." "But I paid $95,000 to save this house," I said, my voice rising with desperation. When the bank was going to foreclose after David's medical bills, I emptied my entire life savings. I took out loans against my car, my credit cards, everything. You promised me the house would be protected. You promised Lily would always have a home here." Nathan stepped forward then, dangling a set of new keys like a taunt. His wife Sarah appeared behind him, holding their baby, wearing an expression of false sympathy that made my stomach turn. "Dad changed his mind," Nathan said with a shrug. "Family circumstances change. We need the house now. You're young. You'll figure something out." I looked at William Morrison, this man who had walked me down the aisle when my own father couldn't make it to the wedding, who had held Lily when she was born, who had cried with me at David's funeral and promised he'd always take care of us. His eyes were cold, distant, like I was a stranger begging on his doorstep. "Please," I whispered, hating how small my voice sounded. "William, please. It's snowing. Lily is 8 years old. Just let us get some clothes tonight. Let us stay until morning and we'll figure out." "No." He stepped back and began closing the door. "You don't live here anymore." The lock clicked. Final. Absolute. I stood there in the falling snow with my daughter, staring at the door that had just closed on our entire lives. The same door where David had carried me over the threshold 7 years ago. The same door where we'd brought Lily home from the hospital. The same door that had been our sanctuary through his illness and death. Lily looked up at me with those big brown eyes, so much like her father's, wide with confusion and fear. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Why doesn't Grandpa want us anymore?" I couldn't answer. I couldn't even breathe. That night, we slept in my Honda Civic in the hospital parking lot. Lily curled up in the back seat with my nursing jacket as a blanket, me in the front with the seat reclined as far as it would go. The snow continued to fall, coating the windshield like a white shroud, muffling the sounds of the world outside. As I listened to my daughter's quiet breathing and felt the cold seeping through the car's struggling heater, I made 2 promises in the darkness. First, I would find out why William Morrison had betrayed us so completely. And second, whatever the truth was, he would regret the day he decided to destroy David's wife and daughter. I just didn't know yet that the truth would be more devastating than anything I could have imagined. What was built before the fall? The memory came to me as I sat in that freezing car, watching my breath fog up the windows while Lily slept fitfully in the back seat. It was August 2018, just 3 months after we'd buried David, when the foreclosure notice arrived like a final cruel joke from the universe. I remember the exact moment because I'd been sitting at the kitchen table in the Morrison house, helping Lily with her second-grade summer workbook, when William burst through the front door with an envelope in his shaking hands. His face was ashen, and for a terrible moment, I thought something had happened to Nathan or one of the grandchildren. "Rebecca," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to talk. Now." Sarah was visiting that day with her 3 children, and she quickly ushered all the kids outside to play in the backyard while William spread the official documents across the dining room table. The same table where we'd shared countless family dinners, where David and I had told everyone we were expecting Lily, where we'd planned his memorial service just months before. "The bank is foreclosing," William said, pointing to the bold red letters across the top of the notice. "We have 45 days before they take the house." I stared at the papers, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The Morrison family had owned this house for 60 years. William had bought it as a young teacher in 1962, raised 3 sons here, welcomed daughters-in-law and grandchildren. This house was supposed to be permanent, unshakable, the one constant in all our lives. "How is this possible?" I asked, scanning the financial breakdown. "I thought the mortgage was almost paid off." William's face crumpled. "David's medical bills," he said quietly. "The experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. The trips to Houston, to Johns Hopkins, to that clinic in Germany. I mortgaged the house to pay for them. I took out a second mortgage, then a third. I would have done anything to save my son." The numbers swam before my eyes. $180,000 in medical debt, converted to mortgages against the house. 18 months of missed payments while William struggled to keep up with minimum payments on a teacher's pension. Interest compounding, penalties adding up, the debt growing like a cancer. "We tried everything," William continued, his hands shaking as he gathered the papers. "Loan modifications, payment plans, selling my retirement investments. Nothing was enough. The bank wants everything paid in full, or they're taking the house in 45 days. I looked around that kitchen, seeing 7 years of memories in every corner. The height marks we'd penciled on the doorframe tracking Lily's growth. The dent in the wall from when David and Nathan had tried to move the refrigerator themselves. The window herb garden David had planted during his remission, still growing strong with basil and rosemary. "How much do they want?" I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. $95,000. William's voice broke completely. "We need $95,000 in 45 days, or we lose everything." I thought about my savings account, the modest nest egg David and I had built over 7 years of careful budgeting and small sacrifices. After his medical expenses and funeral costs, I had maybe $30,000 left. Nowhere near enough. That night, after I'd put Lily to bed and driven home to my tiny apartment, we'd moved out of the Morrison house temporarily while I figured out how to manage everything alone, I sat at my kitchen table with a calculator and a mountain of paperwork. Bank statements, insurance documents, loan applications I'd already been denied for. The math was simple and brutal. I could access $45,000 by liquidating everything: my savings, David's life insurance policy that I'd been saving for Lily's college, my 401k with all the early withdrawal penalties. I could take a loan against my car, max out my credit cards, maybe scrape together another $20,000. Still $30,000 short of what we needed. I called my sister Jennifer in California, swallowing my pride to ask if she could help. She and her husband were doing well, both tech engineers in Silicon Valley, but they'd just bought their own house and taken on massive mortgage payments. "Rebecca, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice thick with guilt. "We're stretched so thin right now. I could maybe send $5,000, but that's literally everything we have liquid." I tried my parents next, then David's uncle in Chicago, then distant relatives I barely knew. Everyone was sympathetic, everyone wished they could help more, but no one had the kind of money we needed. The clock kept ticking, and the number never got smaller. It was Lily who gave me the final push I needed. On a Thursday evening, about 3 weeks into our countdown to foreclosure, She was playing with her dollhouse in my apartment when she looked up at me with those serious brown eyes. "Mommy, when are we going back to Grandpa's house? I miss my room there." "Soon, baby," I lied, my throat tight. "We just need to figure some things out first. But all my stuffed animals are there. And Daddy's picture by my bed. And the tree he planted for me in the backyard." That's when I realized what I had to do. This wasn't just about William's house or even my marriage memories. This was about Lily's connection to her father, her sense of stability in a world that had already taken too much from her. David had wanted his daughter to grow up in that house, to have the childhood of consistency and safety that he'd cherished in his own life. The next morning, I called William with a proposal that would change everything. "I can get the money," I told him, sitting in my car outside the hospital before my shift. "All $95,000. But I need a promise from you." "Rebecca, how?" "I've tried everything, called every bank, every—" "I'll liquidate everything I have," I interrupted. "David's life insurance, my retirement, everything. I'll take out loans against my car, my credit cards, whatever it takes." "But William, I need you to promise me something." There was silence on the other end of the line. "The house has to be transferred to my name," I continued. "Not now, I understand you want to keep living there. But when you're gone, when you're ready to downsize or move to assisted living, whatever happens, the house goes to me and Lily. She gets to grow up in her father's childhood home. She gets that stability." "Of course," William said immediately, his voice thick with emotion. "Rebecca, that house has always been yours and Lily's home. David would want that. We all want that." "I need it in writing," I said, surprised by my own firmness. "A legal document saying that when you transfer ownership, it goes to me. Not to Nathan, not split between the sons. To me, for Lily." "Absolutely. We'll go to a lawyer next week and get it all documented properly. Rebecca, you're saving our family. You're saving David's legacy. I can never repay you for this." It took me 6 weeks to gather the money. I liquidated David's $25,000 life insurance policy, the money I'd planned to save for Lily's college. I withdrew my entire 401k, paying massive penalties that reduced my $18,000 retirement to $13,000. I took out a loan against my car, borrowed against my credit cards, and took an advance on my salary. Jennifer came through with the promised $5,000, and I borrowed another $10,000 from my credit union at an interest rate that made me nauseated. I picked up extra shifts at the hospital, working 16-hour days for 3 weeks straight, my exhaustion so complete that I sometimes fell asleep standing up in the elevator between floors. But I did it. On September 30, 2018, 44 days after that first foreclosure notice, I walked into First National Bank with a certified check for $95,000. The amount represented every penny I'd saved in my adult life, every dollar of security I'd built for my daughter's future, every safety net David and I had carefully constructed. The loan officer, Mrs. Patterson, looked at me with something like awe as she processed the payment. "This is quite remarkable, Mrs. Morrison," she said. "Most families facing foreclosure can't pull together this kind of money on short notice. You've saved your family home." "I've saved my daughter's home," I corrected her. That afternoon, William and I met with his lawyer, Robert Hutchinson, to draft the succession document we'd discussed. It was simple and clear. Upon William Morrison's death or decision to transfer ownership, the property at 428 Elm Street would pass directly to Rebecca Chin Morrison, to be held in trust for Lily Morrison. "This is very generous of you, Mr. Morrison," Hutchinson said as William signed the document. "Not many men your age are willing to bypass their sons in favor of a daughter-in-law." "Rebecca saved this house," William replied firmly. "She sacrificed everything to keep it in the family. It's only right that it should be hers." I remember the moment he handed me the signed document, how solid it felt in my hands, how official the notary seal looked in the bottom corner. I remember thinking that no matter what else happened, Lily would always have this house, this connection to her father, this stability that no one could take away from her. "Thank you," I said to William, meaning it completely. This means everything to me. To Lily. He hugged me then, the kind of warm, paternal embrace I'd been missing since my own father died. Your family, Rebecca. Real family. This house will always be yours and Lily's home. I kept that document in a fireproof safe in my apartment, along with our other important papers. Insurance policies, birth certificates, David's death certificate, Lily's social security card. The things that proved who we were, what we owned, what we were owed. For 16 months, I believed that document meant something. For 16 months, I thought family promises had weight, that legal papers provided protection, that sacrificing everything for the people you love would be remembered and honored. Sitting in that freezing car with my daughter shivering in the back seat, I realized how naive I'd been. But I also realized something else. I still had that document. And if William Morrison thought he could steal my daughter's future and get away with it, he was about to learn exactly how much fight a grieving mother could summon when her child's security was threatened. The snow kept falling, but I wasn't just cold anymore. I was calculating. And tomorrow, I would start gathering the evidence that would prove the Morrison family had made the biggest mistake of their lives when they decided to betray David's wife and daughter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The pattern started when I was too grief-stricken to notice it, too trusting to question it, and too grateful for family support to see the manipulation happening right in front of me. It began 3 days after David's funeral, when I was still moving through the world like a ghost, barely able to dress myself, let alone handle the practical matters of death. I was sitting in William's living room, staring blankly at sympathy cards while Lily colored quietly in the corner, when Nathan made his first move. "Rebecca, we need to talk about David's things," he said, settling into the armchair across from me with a manila folder in his hands. "His tools, his books, the boat, stuff like that." I looked up at him through the fog of grief and medication the doctor had prescribed to help me sleep. Nathan was 2 years older than David, broader through the shoulders, with the same brown hair but harder eyes. He worked in construction management and had always carried himself like someone used to being in charge. I hadn't really thought about it yet, I admitted. It's only been a week. I can't even think about going through his closet, much less. "That's exactly why we need to handle this now," Nathan interrupted gently. "Well, you're not thinking clearly. Dad and I have been talking, and we think it's best if the family keeps David's valuable things safe for you. You know, so you don't make any emotional decisions you'll regret later." He opened the folder and pulled out a handwritten list. "We've cataloged everything. The boat, his woodworking tools, the vintage guitar collection, his coin collection, the hunting rifles. Stuff that could get damaged or stolen if it sits around too long." Through my medicated haze, this seemed reasonable. David's workshop in the garage was full of expensive tools he'd accumulated over 15 years of weekend projects. His boat was worth at least $35,000. The guitar collection was his pride and joy, vintage Fenders and Gibsons he'd been collecting since high school. "We'll store everything at my place," Nathan continued. "I've got that big garage, proper climate control. When you're ready to deal with it, when Lily's older and might want some of her dad's things, we'll make sure everything's in perfect condition." "That's very thoughtful," I said, meaning it. The idea of walking into David's workshop, of seeing his tools hanging exactly where he'd left them, of smelling his cologne still lingering on his work shirts, made me feel physically sick. "I appreciate you thinking of that." "Family takes care of family," Nathan said, but something in his tone didn't quite match his words. "Why don't you sign this inventory list, just so we have everything documented properly?" I signed without reading it carefully. I signed a lot of things those first few weeks, insurance forms and legal documents and bank paperwork that William and Nathan brought me. Everyone was so helpful, so concerned about making sure I didn't have to handle complicated matters while I was grieving. Everyone wanted to protect me from difficult decisions. The next incident happened 6 weeks later, when I'd started to emerge from the worst of the grief fog and was trying to establish some kind of routine for Lily and me. I came to pick her up from an afternoon at William's house and found Nathan in the driveway, loading David's boat onto a trailer. "What are you doing?" I asked, a spike of alarm cutting through my general numbness. Taking it to the marina, Nathan said without looking up from the hitch he was adjusting. Can't leave it sitting in Dad's driveway all winter. Salt air, snow, temperature changes, it'll ruin the engine if we don't get it properly winterized and stored. This also seemed reasonable. David had always been meticulous about boat maintenance, and I knew nothing about winterizing engines or proper storage. But something about watching my husband's boat disappear down Elm Street made my chest tight with anxiety. When will it come back? I asked. Spring, probably. Maybe summer. Depends on when you're ready to deal with selling it. Selling it? I turned to stare at him. Who said anything about selling David's boat? Nathan straightened up, giving me a look I was starting to recognize, patient, slightly condescending, like I was a child who didn't understand adult matters. Rebecca, be practical. You don't know how to drive a boat. Lily's too young. Storage fees alone are $400 a month, plus maintenance, insurance, registration. It's a luxury you can't afford as a single mother. He was right about the money, and we both knew it. David's death benefits had covered the funeral and some of the medical debt, but I was still drowning in bills. My salary as a pediatric nurse was decent, but it wasn't enough to maintain the lifestyle David and I had built together. I haven't decided anything yet, I said weakly. Of course not. That's why we're keeping it safe until you're ready to make smart decisions. Nathan secured the trailer hitch and looked at me with what appeared to be genuine concern. Rebecca, I'm trying to help you here. David would want us to make sure you and Lily are taken care of, not drowning in expenses for things you'll never use. The boat disappeared that afternoon, and I told myself Nathan was being helpful. I told myself David would appreciate his brother protecting his investment until I could think clearly about the future. But the pattern was establishing itself, and I was too naive to see it. 3 months after the funeral, Sarah started making comments about Lily's college fund. We were having Sunday dinner at William's house, one of the weekly family gatherings that had been David's favorite tradition, when she brought up a financial planning seminar she'd attended. The speaker was talking about how many parents don't start saving early enough for college, Sarah said, cutting up food for her youngest while she talked. He said by the time kids are Lily's age, you should already have at least $20,000 saved if you want them to have any real options for good schools. I felt my face flush with embarrassment. Lily was 7 then, and her college fund had exactly $3,400 in it, money David and I had saved before his diagnosis ate through our finances like acid. Of course, every family situation is different, Sarah continued with false sympathy. Some kids are just going to have to settle for community college or state schools. Nothing wrong with that. Nathan went to state school and he turned out fine. Lily's very smart, I said defensively. She might earn scholarships. Oh, absolutely. She's a bright little girl. But you can't count on scholarships, can you? The competition is so intense now. And frankly, coming from a single-parent household, without the advantages of private tutoring and enrichment programs. She trailed off with a meaningful shrug. Nathan picked up the thread smoothly. What Sarah's getting at is that Lily's going to need every advantage she can get. Which is why we've been thinking, David's coin collection is worth about $15,000. His guitar collection is probably worth even more. If we sold those and put the money into a proper college investment account, it could grow to maybe $60,000 or $70,000 by the time she's 18. We could manage the account for you, Sarah added helpfully. Nathan's good with investments. Much better than letting that money just sit around doing nothing. I felt cornered, criticized for not being a better provider for my daughter while simultaneously being offered a solution that required giving up more of David's possessions. The coins and guitars were some of the few things of his that I could imagine Lily actually wanting someday, tangible pieces of her father's personality and interests. I need to think about it, I said. Of course, Nathan replied. But don't think too long. The best investment accounts require minimum deposits, and there are deadlines for setting up educational savings plans to get the tax benefits. Over the following months, the pressure intensified gradually, professionally. Comments about how expensive it was becoming to store all of David's things. Observations about how I never visited the storage unit to see his tools anyway. Suggestions that keeping his guitars was living in the past, instead of building Lily's future. Finally, 8 months after David's death, I agreed to sell the coin collection. Nathan handled everything, finding a dealer, negotiating the price, setting up what he called Lily's education fund. He showed me paperwork indicating that the $18,000 from the sale had been invested in her name, though I never received any account statements or direct access to the money. Trust accounts work differently, he explained when I asked about statements. The money's protected until she's 18, but we manage it to make sure it grows properly. You'll get annual reports showing how it's performing. I never saw those annual reports. The guitar collection disappeared 6 months later, sold to pay for what Nathan called account management fees and investment optimization. David's tools went next, then his hunting equipment, then finally the boat itself, all converted to cash for Lily's future, all managed by Nathan and Sarah, who understood these complex financial matters better than I did. By the time I moved into the Morrison house after saving it from foreclosure, almost everything of David's had been liquidated for his daughter's benefit. Everything except the memories and the few photo albums I'd hidden in my own apartment before Nathan could decide they needed to be preserved professionally at some facility that would charge storage fees. I told myself the family was helping. I told myself David would approve of turning his hobbies into his daughter's education. I told myself that Nathan and Sarah understood money management in ways that I, with my simple nursing salary and basic understanding of budgets, could never master. What I didn't understand until much later was that there had never been any college fund. There had never been any investment accounts or educational trusts. Nathan had simply sold my husband's possessions and kept the money, using my grief and financial insecurity to manipulate me into handing over everything of value that David had left behind. The total value of everything Nathan had convinced me to let him manage? I would later discover it was close to $75,000. More than enough to have covered Lily's college expenses, or to have given us real financial security during those difficult years after David's death. Instead, that money had paid for Nathan and Sarah's kitchen renovation, their family vacation to Disney World, their new SUV. They'd used my husband's legacy to upgrade their own lifestyle while convincing me they were protecting my daughter's future. But I didn't know any of this yet as I sat in my car that December night, watching snow accumulate on the windshield. I didn't know that Nathan's helpful management of David's estate had been the first phase of a long-term plan to strip away everything the Morrison family had ever promised me. What I did know, with growing certainty, was that the same people who had convinced me to trust them with my husband's possessions had just stolen my daughter's home. And this time, I wasn't going to be too grateful or too grief-stricken to fight back. This time, I was going to find out exactly what the Morrison family had been taking from us all along. The decision to fight back came to me at 3:47 a.m., sitting in that hospital parking lot with my sleeping daughter in the back seat and my breath fogging up the windows. I was scrolling through my phone, looking for 24-hour motels we could afford, when I accidentally opened my voice memo app instead of my browser. There, staring back at me in a list of forgotten recordings, were dozens of audio files I'd made over the past 18 months. Notes to myself about conversations with William and Nathan, reminders about promises they'd made, questions I'd wanted to ask but had been too polite or too grateful to voice at the time. I'd started recording these memos during those first confusing weeks after David's funeral, when my grief brain couldn't hold on to details and I kept forgetting important things people told me. What had begun as a memory aid had accidentally become something much more valuable, a documented record of exactly how the Morrison family had been manipulating me from the very beginning. I pressed play on the oldest file, dated just 5 days after we buried David. My own voice came through the phone speaker, shaky and medicated. Note to self: Nathan says he needs to take David's boat to winterize it, but David always said he winterized it himself in the garage. Why does it need to go to a marina? And why won't Nathan tell me which marina? Also, William mentioned something about insurance policies I need to sign, but I don't remember David ever talking about changing our life insurance. Need to ask about this when I'm thinking more clearly. I'd never asked about any of those things. I'd been too overwhelmed, too dependent on their help, too afraid of seeming ungrateful when they were doing so much to support Lily and me. The next recording was from 3 weeks later. Sarah made another comment about how expensive Lily's dance lessons are, how maybe we should think about more practical activities for a child in our situation. But Lily loves dance class. It's the only thing that makes her smile since David died. Why does Sarah care what activities we can afford? Also, Nathan asked me again about David's coin collection. He keeps saying we should sell it while the market is good, but how does he know what the market is for coins? He's never collected anything except baseball cards. File after file revealed the same pattern: my growing unease about the Morrison family's suggestions and decisions, questions I'd been too polite to ask, instincts I'd been too grateful to trust. By dawn, I'd listened to over 2 hours of my own voice documenting 18 months of subtle manipulation and control. The most damning recording was from just 6 weeks ago, when William had invited me to dinner to discuss family finances. I'd made the voice memo in my car afterward, trying to process a conversation that had left me feeling confused and vaguely threatened. William was acting strange tonight, my recorded voice said. He kept asking about my work schedule, whether I was planning to stay at the hospital long term, whether I'd ever considered moving to a different city for a better job. Then he said something weird about how the house was getting too big for him, how he was thinking about simplifying his living situation. When I mentioned the succession document we signed, he got really quiet and said we might need to revisit that arrangement given changing family circumstances. What changing circumstances? And why was Nathan there taking notes like it was a business meeting? I remembered that dinner now with perfect clarity. How William had seemed nervous, almost guilty. How Nathan had steered the conversation toward my finances, my job prospects, my ability to maintain a household. How they'd both emphasized repeatedly that I was still young and could start fresh somewhere new. They'd been planning this for weeks, maybe months. The dinner had been a reconnaissance mission, gathering information about my vulnerabilities and options before they made their move. As Lily stirred in the back seat, mumbling something about being cold, I realized I had a choice to make. I could accept what had happened, find us an apartment somewhere, start over with nothing but my job and whatever furniture I could fit in a moving truck. I could preserve the peace, maintain family relationships, and spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I'd fought for what David had wanted his daughter to have. Or I could use what I'd accidentally documented to prove that the Morrison family had been systematically betraying my trust since the day we buried David. I could fight for the home I'd paid for, the security I'd sacrificed everything to provide, the future David had wanted for his daughter. The second option terrified me. I'd never sued anyone, never been in legal conflict with anyone, never been the kind of person who caused family drama or aired private grievances in public. But as I looked at Lily's sleeping face, remembering how she'd stood on that porch for 2 hours believing that someone would eventually come home and let her in, I felt something harden in my chest. I wasn't going to let William Morrison steal my daughter's birthright and get away with it. At 7 a.m., I called my sister Jennifer in California, waking her up to ask a question that would change everything. Jen, I need the name of a good lawyer. The best lawyer you know. Rebecca? Are you okay? It's 4 a.m. here. Did something happen? The Morrison family locked us out of the house. They changed the locks and told us we don't live there anymore. After I paid $95,000 to save it from foreclosure. After William promised me in writing that it would be ours. There was a long silence. Then Jennifer's voice came back, sharp and alert. They did what? Rebecca, that's fraud. That might be criminal fraud. Do you have documentation of the money you paid? Do you have the succession agreement? I have everything. And Jen, I think they've been stealing from us for months. David's tools, his boat, his collections. Nathan convinced me to let him sell everything for Lily's college fund, but I don't think there ever was a college fund. Jesus Christ, Rebecca. How much money are we talking about? Maybe $75,000, total. Plus the $95,000 I paid to save the house. $170,000. They stole $170,000 from a widow and her 8-year-old daughter. Jennifer's voice was tight with rage. I'm texting you a name right now. Diane Walsh. She's a family law attorney here in San Francisco, but she went to law school with someone back east who specializes in exactly this kind of case. Financial elder abuse, family fraud, that kind of thing. Elder abuse? I'm 34. Emotional manipulation of vulnerable family members for financial gain. Doesn't matter how old you are. What matters is they took advantage of your grief and trust to steal from you and your daughter. Jennifer paused. Rebecca, are you absolutely sure you want to do this? Suing family members, it's going to get ugly. There's going to be publicity, gossip, people taking sides. And it's expensive. Good lawyers cost money you probably don't have right now. I looked at Lily, still sleeping in the back seat, and thought about how she'd asked why Grandpa didn't love us anymore. I thought about the dance classes Sarah had convinced me to cancel because they were too expensive. I thought about Nathan selling David's guitars while telling me it was for our daughter's future. They already made it ugly, I said. They stole from us and then threw us out in the snow. I'm done being grateful for their help. Jennifer texted me 3 names within an hour, lawyers in Boston, New York, and Hartford who specialized in family fraud cases. I called the Hartford number first, since Connecticut was closest, and reached the voicemail of attorney Michael Torres. Mr. Torres, my name is Rebecca Morrison, and I need help with what I think might be a family fraud case. My in-laws convinced me to pay $95,000 to save their house from foreclosure, promising it would become mine, and then locked my daughter and me out after changing the locks. They also convinced me over the past 18 months to let them sell my deceased husband's possessions, supposedly for my daughter's college fund, but I don't think that fund exists. I have documentation of the payments and promises, and I have audio recordings of conversations that might be relevant. Please call me back as soon as possible. Torres called me back within 2 hours. Mrs. Morrison, I've been practicing family law for 23 years, and what you're describing sounds like textbook financial fraud with possible elder abuse elements. How soon can you come to my office? I'm living in my car with my 8-year-old daughter right now, I said. I can come whenever you have time. Can you be here at 2 o'clock this afternoon? And Mrs. Morrison, bring everything. Every document, every recording, every piece of evidence you have. If what you're telling me is accurate, we're going to make the Morrison family very sorry they decided to steal from you. That afternoon, sitting in Michael Torres's law office while Lily colored quietly in the corner, I laid out everything. The succession document William had signed. The bank records showing my $95,000 payment. The inventory lists Nathan had prepared when he took David's possessions. Screenshots of text messages and emails. And most importantly, 2 hours of voice memos documenting my growing unease about the family's behavior. Torres listened to everything, taking notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and smiled, not a friendly smile, but the kind of smile a shark might wear just before attacking. Mrs. Morrison, in 23 years of practice, I've rarely seen a case with this much clear evidence of systematic fraud. Your in-laws didn't just steal from you, they documented their theft, and you accidentally recorded them planning it. He tapped his pen against his legal pad. We're going to file suit within the week. Breach of contract, fraud, conversion of assets, intentional infliction of emotional distress. We're going to demand the house, compensation for the stolen possessions, punitive damages, and attorney's fees. How long will it take? I asked. Depends on how smart they are. If they're smart, they'll settle quickly and quietly. If they're arrogant enough to fight this in court with the evidence we have. He shrugged. Then we're going to destroy them publicly and financially. Either way, Mrs. Morrison, your daughter is getting her home back. For the first time since that terrible night in the snow, I felt something like hope. The Morrison family thought they'd crushed me, thought I was too weak and too grateful to fight back. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The investigation began with a single phone call that changed everything I thought I knew about the Morrison family's finances. 3 days after meeting with Michael Torres, while Lily and I were staying at a budget motel that charged by the week, Torres called with information that made my hands shake. Rebecca, I've been doing some preliminary research into your in-laws' financial situation, and we need to talk immediately. Can you come to my office this morning? Is something wrong with our case? I asked, my stomach dropping. I'd been so certain that the evidence was clear, that justice would be straightforward. On the contrary. The case just got much bigger than we thought. 2 hours later, I sat across from Torres while he spread documents across his conference table like pieces of a puzzle that was finally coming together. I ran a basic asset search on William Morrison, he began, just to get an idea of what we might be able to recover in damages. What I found was interesting. He pulled out a property records report. According to county records, William doesn't just own the house on Elm Street. He owns 4 other properties around Hartford. I stared at the documents, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. That's impossible. William was a high school teacher for 40 years. He's been retired for 8 years. How could he afford 4 investment properties? That's what I wondered too. Torres pulled out another set of papers. So I dug deeper. These properties were all purchased within the last 5 years, all paid for in cash, totaling approximately $1.2 million. The room seemed to tilt around me. William told me he was broke. He said David's medical bills had destroyed his finances, that he'd mortgaged the house to pay for treatments. He said he'd lost his retirement savings trying to keep up with payments. According to his bank records, which I obtained through legal discovery processes, William Morrison has never been in financial distress. His pension and Social Security provide him with over $7,000 a month in income. His savings account currently contains $340,000. And Rebecca, here's the most important part, the medical bills he claimed forced him to mortgage the house? They were mostly paid by David's insurance. I felt like I was drowning in information that didn't make sense. Then why did he need me to pay off the foreclosure? Why was the house in danger if he had all this money? Torres's expression grew grim. Because the foreclosure was manufactured. William took out a mortgage against the house not to pay medical bills, but to buy his investment properties. He used the equity in the family home as a down payment for a real estate portfolio. Then, when he needed more cash to complete those purchases, he deliberately stopped making mortgage payments. The pieces began clicking into place with horrible clarity. He created the foreclosure on purpose? That's what the evidence suggests. Look at this timeline. Torres showed me a financial spreadsheet he'd created. March 2018, William takes out a $200,000 mortgage against the Elm Street house. April 2018, he purchases the first investment property for $280,000 cash. June 2018, second property, $310,000 cash. August 2018, he stops making mortgage payments on the family home. October 2018, foreclosure notice arrives. But David died in May 2018, I said, my voice barely a whisper. William was already planning this before David was even buried. It appears so. And Rebecca, there's more. Torres pulled out a thick folder. I've been investigating Nathan's finances as well. Remember all of David's possessions that he convinced you to let him sell for Lily's college fund? My throat felt tight. Please tell me there's actually a college fund. There isn't. But I can tell you exactly where that money went. Torres opened the folder to reveal bank statements, loan documents, and purchase receipts. Nathan used the proceeds from selling your husband's belongings to make improvements to his own home. New kitchen, $23,000. Bathroom renovation, $18,000. New deck and landscaping, $12,000. The boat sale alone paid for his family's vacation to Europe last summer. I stared at the receipts, seeing David's legacy converted into granite countertops and hardwood flooring for the brother who had promised to protect his daughter's future. How much total? Based on the sales receipts I've found, Nathan sold approximately $78,000 worth of David's possessions. None of it went into any kind of educational savings account. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was clean and sharp and completely clarifying. They planned this from the beginning. From the day we buried David, they were planning to steal everything from us. That's my assessment as well. But Rebecca, here's what we're going to do about it. Torres pulled out a legal document he'd been preparing. We're not just suing for the house anymore. We're suing for everything. Fraud, conspiracy, theft by deception, intentional infliction of emotional distress. We're demanding the return of the house, compensation for all of David's stolen possessions, punitive damages for the deliberate emotional trauma inflicted on you and Lily, and restitution for the financial hardship they've caused. How much are we talking about? Conservative estimate? $400,000. Plus attorney's fees. Plus we're going to demand that William transfer ownership of one of his investment properties to you as additional compensation for the systematic fraud. I thought about sleeping in my car with Lily, about the dance classes I'd cancelled, about the months of living on rice and beans because I'd given William every penny I had to save a house that was never actually in danger. Will we win? Rebecca, I've practiced law for 23 years. I've never seen a case with more clear-cut evidence of fraud. Your voice memos alone are enough to prove their intent to deceive you. Combined with the financial records showing William's actual wealth and Nathan's use of stolen money for personal expenses? Torres smiled. We're going to destroy them. How long will it take? I'm filing the complaint tomorrow. They'll have 20 days to respond. Given the strength of our evidence, I expect they'll want to settle quickly and quietly rather than have this become public. But if they choose to fight it? He shrugged. Then we'll take them to trial and let a jury decide how much they owe you. That afternoon, Torres served the lawsuit papers personally at the Morrison family home. According to the process server's report, William answered the door in his bathrobe at 3 p.m., clearly not expecting visitors. When handed the legal documents, he'd gone completely white and had to sit down on the front porch steps. He kept saying, "She can't do this, she's family," the process server told Torres later. Then he called for his son Nathan, and when Nathan read the papers, he started shouting about ungrateful women and family loyalty. Quite a scene, apparently. Nathan called me that evening. I almost didn't answer the phone, but Torres had advised me to take any calls from the family and record them if possible. Rebecca, what the hell do you think you're doing? Nathan's voice was tight with rage. Suing your own family? After everything we've done for you? Everything you've done to me, you mean, I replied, keeping my voice calm while I activated the voice memo app. Like stealing $78,000 worth of David's possessions. Like convincing me to bankrupt myself to save a house that was never actually in financial danger. We helped you through the worst time of your life. We took care of you when you couldn't take care of yourself. You manipulated my grief to steal from me and my daughter. There's a difference. You can't prove any of this. You signed papers agreeing to let us manage David's estate. You volunteered to pay off the house. No one forced you to do anything. I thought about the voice memos documenting months of pressure and manipulation, about the financial records Torres had uncovered, about William's fake tears when he begged me to save the family home that he could have saved himself without breaking a sweat. Nathan, I have recordings of conversations where you and William discussed how to convince me to give up David's possessions. I have bank records showing exactly where that money went. I have proof that William deliberately created the foreclosure to manipulate me into paying for it. I paused. You stole from a widow and her child, and you documented your theft. You're going to lose everything. There was a long silence. Then Nathan's voice came back, smaller and more desperate. Rebecca, let's be reasonable about this. We can work something out. Family shouldn't fight in court. You should have thought about that before you decided to steal my daughter's inheritance. What do you want? Money? We can give you money to make this go away. I want the house that I paid for. I want compensation for everything you stole from David's daughter. And I want all of it in writing, legally binding, so you can never betray our trust again. That's impossible. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. You should have thought about that before you committed hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of fraud. I ended the call and immediately sent the recording to Torres. He called me back within an hour. Rebecca, that conversation was perfect. Nathan essentially admitted to taking David's possessions and acknowledged that they manipulated you into paying for the house. If they were thinking about fighting this case, that phone call just changed their minds. What happens now? Now we wait for their lawyer to call me and ask how much it's going to cost them to make this go away. And Rebecca? Based on that phone call, I think we're going to get everything we asked for. For the first time since that terrible night in the snow, I felt like we were going to win. The Morrison family had underestimated me, had assumed I would never have the strength or resources to fight back. They were about to learn that stealing from David's daughter was the biggest mistake they'd ever made. The revelation came through a phone call I should never have received, from a woman who had every reason to hate me but chose truth over loyalty instead. It was Sarah's sister Michelle, calling me at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after we'd filed the lawsuit. Rebecca? This is Michelle Garrett. Sarah's sister. I know we've never really talked, but I need to tell you something about your husband's death. I sat up in the motel bed where Lily was sleeping, my heart immediately racing. What about David's death? Michelle, what are you talking about? I've been struggling with this for months, ever since Sarah started bragging about the house renovations. I knew something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it until I heard about your lawsuit. Her voice was shaking. Rebecca, I was with Sarah the day David died. I drove her to the hospital when Nathan called to say David had taken a turn for the worse. I remembered that day with perfect clarity. David had been improving, talking about coming home, making plans for Lily's summer vacation. Then suddenly, around 2 p.m., his condition deteriorated rapidly. The doctor said it was unexpected but not uncommon. Sometimes patients rallied briefly before the end. I was in the hospital cafeteria with Sarah when her phone rang, Michelle continued. It was William, calling to tell her that David had passed. But Rebecca, Sarah's reaction was wrong. She didn't cry or seem shocked. She said, "Good, that's perfect timing," and then immediately called someone else. My mouth went dry. Who did she call? I don't know, but I heard part of the conversation. She said something about phase 1 being complete, and how they needed to move fast while Rebecca is vulnerable. She talked about a timeline and said they had to lock everything down before she starts thinking clearly. The room seemed to spin around me. Michelle, are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying Sarah knew David was going to die that day. More than that, she was expecting it at a specific time. And she had a plan ready to implement the moment it happened. I thought about the timeline Torres had discovered. William taking out the mortgage against the house in March. The first investment property purchased in April. David's death in May. The systematic collection of his possessions starting just days after the funeral. How could she have known when David would die? Unless. The horrible possibility formed in my mind. Michelle, do you think they did something to him? There was a long silence. Then Michelle's voice came back, barely above a whisper. Rebecca, I've been a nurse for 15 years. I worked in oncology before I had kids. I know what end-stage cancer looks like, and David didn't look like he was dying when I saw him 2 days before. He was weak, sure, but he was alert, talking, making jokes. Patients don't usually go from that to dead in 48 hours without something else happening. What are you saying? I'm saying someone should look at David's medical records. I'm saying someone should ask questions about who had access to his hospital room that day, and what medications he received. Michelle's voice cracked. Rebecca, I think they murdered your husband. The phone slipped from my numb fingers. When I picked it up again, Michelle was still talking. I should have said something sooner. I should have asked questions when Sarah started spending money like she'd won the lottery. But I thought I was being paranoid, thought I was imagining things. It wasn't until I heard about your lawsuit that I realized what I'd witnessed. Michelle, will you testify to this? Will you tell the police what you heard Sarah say? I'll tell anyone who will listen. Sarah is my sister, but what she did to you and Lily is unforgivable. If they killed David to inherit his share of the family assets. She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. I called Torres immediately, waking him up to tell him what Michelle had revealed. His reaction was swift and decisive. Rebecca, this changes everything. If David was murdered, we're not just talking about financial fraud anymore. We're talking about conspiracy to commit murder for financial gain. I'm calling the police first thing in the morning. But how do we prove it? David's been dead for almost 2 years. Exhumation. Autopsy. Toxicology analysis. If someone poisoned him or gave him an overdose of medication, there might still be evidence. And Rebecca, if they killed David, they probably made mistakes. Hospital records, security cameras, testimony from medical staff. Murder cases have a way of unraveling when you start pulling threads. Detective Carmen Rodriguez took my statement the next morning in Torres's office. She was a 20-year veteran of the Hartford Police Department's Major Crimes Unit, and she listened to everything with the kind of focused intensity that made me feel like every word mattered. Mrs. Morrison, I have to ask, why didn't you report these suspicions earlier? If you thought your husband might have been murdered. I didn't think it until last night, I said honestly. David had cancer. When someone with cancer dies, you don't automatically assume murder. But when Michelle told me about Sarah's phone call, about her knowing exactly when he would die. Rodriguez nodded. We'll need to interview Michelle Garrett, get a formal statement. We'll also need to examine David's medical records, interview his medical team, review hospital security footage from that day if it still exists. What about exhumation? Torres asked. Possible, but we'd need a court order. And after 20 months, depending on how he was buried, there might not be much useful evidence left. We'll start with the hospital records and see what those tell us. Rodriguez called me 3 days later with news that made my blood run cold. Mrs. Morrison, we've reviewed your husband's medical records, and there are some irregularities we're concerned about. According to the chart, David received 3 doses of morphine on the day he died, much higher than what his previous pain management indicated. The nurse who administered the final dose has no clear memory of doing so, and the doctor who ordered it says he never authorized that amount of medication. Someone gave him an overdose? It's possible. We're also looking at visitor logs from that day. According to hospital security, William Morrison was in David's room for approximately 30 minutes that afternoon, from 1:15 to 1:45 p.m. David was pronounced dead at 2:17 p.m. I felt like I was falling through the floor. William killed his own son. We don't know that yet. But we know someone gave David enough morphine to stop his breathing, and we know his father was alone with him during the time frame when that medication was administered. Rodriguez paused. Mrs. Morrison, we're going to need you to be very careful over the next few weeks. If the Morrison family is willing to commit murder to protect their financial interests, they might see you and your lawsuit as a threat that needs to be eliminated. That afternoon, Torres filed an emergency motion to freeze all Morrison family assets pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. He also petitioned the court for a restraining order preventing William and Nathan from leaving the state. Rebecca, if they killed David, they're not going to just sit around waiting for us to prove it, he warned. They'll try to liquidate assets, maybe even flee the country. We need to lock everything down immediately. The restraining order was granted that same day. According to Torres's contacts at the courthouse, William Morrison had been at the bank that morning attempting to transfer large sums of money to offshore accounts. The transaction was blocked just hours before he tried to execute it. They're panicking, Torres told me. Guilty people do stupid things when they feel cornered. William trying to move money offshore is basically an admission that he knows he's in serious trouble. That evening, Detective Rodriguez called with the news I'd been both hoping for and dreading. Mrs. Morrison, the district attorney's office has decided to file charges. William Morrison is being arrested tomorrow morning for the murder of David Morrison. Nathan Morrison is being charged as an accessory after the fact. Sarah Morrison is being charged with conspiracy and fraud. What happens now? Now we build the case for trial. The medical evidence, Michelle's testimony about Sarah's phone call, the financial records showing motive, it's all going to come out in court. Your civil lawsuit just became the least of their problems. I hung up the phone and looked at Lily, who was doing homework at the small motel room table, completely unaware that we'd just learned her grandfather had murdered her father for money. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that the family she'd trusted and loved had destroyed everything she'd ever known? But for the first time since that terrible night in the snow, I felt something like justice was possible. The Morrison family had taken everything from us: David's life, his possessions, our home, our security. They'd counted on my grief and gratitude to keep me silent and compliant. They'd underestimated how far a mother would go to protect her daughter's future and honor her husband's memory. Now they were about to learn that some betrayals have consequences that last a lifetime. The truth was finally coming out, and it was more devastating than I'd ever imagined. The web of deception began unraveling with terrifying speed once the arrest started. What I thought was a straightforward case of financial fraud exploded into something far more sinister when Detective Rodriguez called me at 6 a.m. on Thursday morning. "Mrs. Morrison, we need you to come to the station immediately. We've arrested William Morrison, but during the search of his house, we found something that changes everything we thought we knew about this case." "What did you find?" "Documents. Financial records going back 15 years. And Mrs. Morrison, David wasn't their first victim." 2 hours later, I sat in the police station conference room staring at boxes of evidence that painted a picture of systematic murder spanning over a decade. Detective Rodriguez and her partner, Detective James Kim, laid out the timeline with the methodical precision of people who had seen too much evil to be shocked by anything anymore. "We found a safety deposit box key in William's bedroom dresser," Rodriguez began. The box contained detailed financial records, insurance policies, and what appears to be a journal documenting William's activities since 2009. She opened a leather-bound notebook and began reading from William's own handwriting. Entry dated March 15, 2011, "Robert's cancer diagnosis creates opportunity. Increased insurance coverage last month appears prescient. Timeline estimate, 6 to 8 weeks if managed properly." My blood turned to ice. Robert? Who is Robert? Robert Morrison was William's eldest son, Detective Kim explained. David's older brother. He died of cancer in 2011, 8 years before David. According to these records, Robert also had a substantial life insurance policy that benefited William, and he also owned property that William inherited. "Are you saying William killed Robert too?" "We're exhuming Robert's body this afternoon," Rodriguez said grimly. "But based on what we found in this journal, Robert's death follows the same pattern as David's. Sudden deterioration after a period of improvement, unexpected medication overdose, death occurring at a time that was financially convenient for William." She turned to another page in the journal. Entry dated April 3, 2011, "Robert's funeral well attended. Sarah's performance as grieving sister-in-law particularly convincing. Insurance payout will allow acceleration of investment timeline. Nathan unaware of full scope but complicit in estate liquidation." The room spun around me. "How many people did he kill?" Detective Kim pulled out a thick folder. "Based on the journal entries and financial records, we believe William Morrison has been systematically murdering family members for their insurance money and inheritance for at least 15 years. Robert in 2011. His own wife Margaret in 2015. David in 2018. Possibly others." "Margaret?" I felt like I was drowning. William's wife died of a heart attack. I was at her funeral. According to the journal, Margaret became suspicious about Robert's death and started asking questions about the family finances. William writes about Margaret becoming a liability and needing to be managed before she compromises everything. Rodriguez showed me another entry. "Look at this, Margaret's digitalis prescription provides convenient solution. Overdose easily mistaken for cardiac event. Timing must coincide with Nathan's alibi." I thought about Margaret Morrison, William's quiet, gentle wife who had always been kind to me, who had knitted blankets for Lily and made her favorite cookies. She died just 3 years after I married into the family, and William had seemed devastated, playing the grieving widower perfectly. The insurance money from Margaret's death, Detective Kim continued, combined with her life savings and the inheritance from Robert, gave William the capital to start his real estate investment scheme. Every subsequent murder was designed to fund his growing property portfolio. But why David? David wasn't suspicious of anything. He never questioned William about money. Rodriguez turned to a section near the end of the journal. According to these entries, David wasn't planned initially. But when David got sick and his medical bills started mounting, William realized his son's death would solve multiple problems simultaneously. She read from the journal, David's condition provides perfect cover for elimination. Cancer death raises no suspicions. Rebecca's gratitude for family support ensures cooperation with estate liquidation. Timing critical, must occur after insurance policy increases but before medical expenses exhaust assets. Nathan prepared to manage inheritance distribution and widow manipulation. The words hit me like physical blows. William had murdered his own son not out of necessity, but out of convenience. David's cancer had been an opportunity, not a tragedy. Mrs. Morrison, Detective Kim said gently, we need to prepare you for what's going to happen next. This case is going to be massive. Multiple murder charges spanning over a decade. The media attention is going to be intense. The Morrison family is going to try to discredit you, claim you're making false accusations for financial gain. But you have William's own journal. His own confession. We do. But Nathan and Sarah are going to claim they knew nothing about the murders, that they were just following William's instructions about managing family assets. They're going to paint themselves as victims of William's manipulation, just like you. Rodriguez leaned forward. Rebecca, there's something else. We found evidence that William was planning to kill you too. The room went silent except for the humming of fluorescent lights. What? She showed me a journal entry dated just 2 weeks before they'd locked us out of the house. Rebecca becoming problematic. Lawsuit threatens exposure. Lily's inheritance claim could trigger investigation of previous deaths. Resolution required before spring. Accident during relocation would remove both obstacles permanently. I couldn't breathe. He was going to kill me and Lily. That's what it looks like. The plan was to make your deaths look accidental, carbon monoxide poisoning in your car, maybe, or a traffic accident during your move to a new city. With you and Lily dead, there would be no one left to question the family's financial dealings or demand accounting for David's estate. Detective Kim pulled out another document. This is probably what saved your life. You filed the lawsuit faster than they expected. Once legal proceedings started, killing you would have been too suspicious. Instead, they tried to intimidate you into dropping the case. I thought about Nathan's angry phone call, his demands that I be reasonable about settling the lawsuit. I thought about the strange cars I'd noticed following me to work, the way William had watched me at David's funeral like he was measuring me for something. So Nathan and Sarah knew about the plan to kill us? Sarah definitely knew, Rodriguez confirmed. We found text messages between her and William discussing permanent solutions to the Rebecca problem. Nathan's involvement is less clear, but he was certainly aware that something more than financial fraud was being planned. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. This wasn't just a family stealing from a widow, this was a murder enterprise that had been operating for over a decade, with my husband and daughter as the final intended victims. What happens now? I asked. Now the real investigation begins, Detective Kim said. We're coordinating with police departments in 3 other states where William owned property. There may be more victims we don't know about yet. We're exhuming bodies, interviewing witnesses, tracing financial records going back 20 years. And in the meantime? In the meantime, you and Lily are in protective custody until we can ensure your safety. William is being held without bail, but Nathan and Sarah are still out there, and they know their entire world is collapsing. Rodriguez closed the journal. People facing life in prison sometimes make desperate choices. That afternoon, U.S. Marshals moved Lily and me to a safe house in a suburb outside Hartford. It was a nondescript ranch house with bulletproof windows and federal agents stationed outside 24 hours a day. Lily thought it was an adventure at first, but as the days stretched into weeks and she couldn't go to school or see her friends, the reality of our situation began to sink in. "Mommy, are we ever going to have a normal life again?" she asked one evening as we sat in the safe house living room, watching the news coverage of William's arraignment. The reporter was calling it one of the most shocking family murder conspiracies in Connecticut history. William Morrison, the trusted high school teacher and pillar of the community, had been systematically killing his own family members for over 15 years. The death toll was up to 5 confirmed victims, with 3 more cases under investigation. "Yes, baby," I told her, pulling her close. "We're going to have a better life than we ever had before. Because now we know the truth, and the truth is going to set us free." But looking at the news footage of neighbors expressing shock and disbelief, of former students defending William's character, of reporters speculating about how many more victims there might be, I wondered if we would ever really be free from the shadow of what the Morrison family had done. The web of lies was finally unraveling, but the truth was more horrific than I had ever imagined. And somewhere out there, Nathan and Sarah were still free, still dangerous, still desperate to protect themselves from the consequences of their participation in over a decade of murder and fraud. The worst was yet to come. The trial began on a cold February morning, almost exactly 2 years after that terrible night when they'd locked us out in the snow. I walked into the Hartford Superior Court building with Lily beside me, both of us wearing our best clothes, ready to face the Morrison family one last time. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Media representatives filled the front rows, their cameras and notebooks ready to document every moment of what the newspapers were calling the Morrison murder trial. Behind them sat dozens of spectators, former students of Williams, neighbors who couldn't believe the accusations, family friends who had known the Morrisons for decades. And there, at the defendant's table, sat William Morrison in an orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled, looking like the broken old man he'd become. Beside him sat Nathan and Sarah, both free on bail but facing their own charges of conspiracy and accessory to murder. The transformation in their appearances was striking. William, once the dignified retired teacher with his cardigans and reading glasses, now looked gaunt and hollow-eyed. Nathan had lost at least 30 pounds, his face drawn with stress and sleepless nights. Sarah, who had always prided herself on her appearance, looked haggard despite her obvious attempts to maintain her composure. Judge Patricia Hawthorne called the court to order, and District Attorney Elena Rodriguez, no relation to Detective Rodriguez, stood to deliver her opening statement. What followed was the most devastating 90 minutes of legal argument I had ever witnessed. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," DA Rodriguez began, "over the next 3 weeks, you are going to hear testimony about a man who systematically murdered 5 members of his own family over the course of 15 years. Not for passion, not in the heat of anger, but for money. Cold, calculated, premeditated murder for financial gain." She walked the jury through the timeline methodically. Robert Morrison's death in 2011, followed immediately by William's inheritance of his property and collection of his life insurance. Margaret Morrison's death in 2015, after she began questioning the family finances. David Morrison's death in 2018, aimed perfectly to coincide with William's need for additional investment capital. The defendant kept detailed records of his crimes, DA Rodriguez continued, holding up William's leather journal. He documented his methods, his timing, his financial gains. He wrote about his victims not as beloved family members, but as obstacles to his wealth accumulation. He planned their deaths like business investments. She showed the jury photographs of William's real estate portfolio, for luxury properties worth over $1.2 million, all purchased with the blood money from his murdered family members. She presented bank records showing the systematic conversion of life insurance payouts into property investments. She displayed William's own handwritten notes calculating the optimal timing for each death to maximize financial benefit. The defense attorney, a man named Marcus Webb who specialized in high-profile criminal cases, attempted to paint William as a grieving father who had lost his mind after watching multiple family members die of natural causes. He argued that the journal entries were the delusional writings of a man suffering from dementia and depression, not the calculated plans of a serial killer. William Morrison is a man who devoted 40 years of his life to educating children, Webb argued. He is a pillar of this community, a man who has given more to society than he has taken. The prosecution wants you to believe that this gentle educator suddenly became a calculating murderer in his 70s. They want you to believe that grief and loss drove him to create an elaborate fantasy of control and conspiracy. But the prosecution's case was overwhelming. Dr. Angela Martinez, the forensic pathologist who had performed new autopsies on the exhumed bodies of Robert, Margaret, and David Morrison, testified that all three showed evidence of fatal drug overdoses that had been missed in the original examinations. Robert Morrison died from an overdose of morphine administered intravenously, Dr. Martinez explained to the jury. The concentration in his system was approximately 4 times what would be therapeutic for his level of cancer pain. This was not a gradual increase in pain medication, this was a massive, fatal dose administered all at once. And Margaret Morrison? Digitalis poisoning. Mrs. Morrison did have a prescription for digitalis to treat her heart condition, but the amount in her system at the time of death was approximately 10 times her prescribed dose. This would have caused immediate cardiac arrest. What about David Morrison? Also morphine overdose, administered intravenously. Again, approximately 4 times the therapeutic dose. In all 3 cases, the cause of death was acute drug toxicity, not the natural progression of illness. The most damaging testimony came from Michelle Garrett, Sarah's sister, who took the stand on the 4th day of the trial. Under oath, she repeated what she had told me about Sarah's suspicious phone call on the day David died, but the prosecution had uncovered even more devastating evidence. Mrs. Garrett, D.A. Rodriguez asked, "Did your sister Sarah ever discuss the Morrison family finances with you?" "Yes, multiple times. She was always complaining about how much money William was spending on David's medical treatments, how it was affecting Nathan's inheritance. She said it wasn't fair that David was eating up the family money when he was going to die anyway." Did she ever suggest a solution to this problem? Michelle's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She said someone needed to put David out of his misery before he bankrupted the whole family. She said it would be a mercy for everyone involved. When did she say this? About 2 weeks before David died. The prosecution also called hospital staff who had been working the day David died. Nurse Jennifer Walsh testified that she had noticed William Morrison in David's room for an unusually long time that afternoon, and that when she checked on David afterward, his 4 line appeared to have been tampered with. The 4 was running much faster than it should have been, Walsh explained. Someone had adjusted the drip rate to maximum flow. If someone had added medication to that 4 bag and increased the flow rate, it would have delivered a massive dose very quickly. Security guard Thomas Chin testified about seeing William Morrison near the hospital's medication storage room that same afternoon, an area where family members were not supposed to have access. But the most shocking testimony came from Nathan Morrison himself. On the 7th day of the trial, in what appeared to be a desperate attempt to save himself from a life sentence, Nathan took the stand and testified against his own father. "My father told me that David was suffering unnecessarily," Nathan said, his voice barely audible in the packed courtroom. "He said it would be kinder to help him pass peacefully rather than let him linger in pain. He asked me to help him get access to David's hospital room." "What did you do?" his lawyer asked. "I created a distraction at the nurse's station so my father could go into David's room alone. I thought he was just going to say goodbye privately. I didn't know he was going to." Nathan broke down completely, sobbing on the witness stand. Under cross-examination, D.A. Rodriguez destroyed Nathan's claim of innocence. "Mr. Morrison, you testified that you thought your father was going to say goodbye privately to your brother. But isn't it true that you had already begun liquidating David's possessions before he was even dead?" What do you mean?" "I mean that according to storage unit rental records, you rented a storage facility to hold David's belongings 3 days before he died. You had already made plans to clear out his possessions before you even knew he was going to die. How do you explain that?" Nathan's facade crumbled completely. "My father said, he said David wasn't going to make it through the week. He said we needed to be prepared." "Prepared for what, Mr. Morrison? Prepared for your brother's natural death, or prepared for the murder you were helping to orchestrate?" The trial lasted 3 weeks, but the verdict took the jury only 4 hours to reach. William Morrison was found guilty on 5 counts of first-degree murder. Nathan Morrison was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and accessory to murder. Sarah Morrison was found guilty of conspiracy and fraud. Judge Hawthorne sentenced William to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She sentenced Nathan to 25 years to life. Sarah received 15 years for her role in the conspiracy. The crimes committed by this family represent a betrayal of the most fundamental bonds of human trust, Judge Hawthorne said as she delivered the sentences. You murdered your own children, your own spouse, for money. You corrupted the sacred relationships of family and turned them into instruments of greed and murder. These crimes are among the most heinous this court has ever encountered. After the sentencing, I stood outside the courthouse with Lily and our lawyer Michael Torres, facing a crowd of reporters and cameras. For 2 years, I had been fighting for justice for David and for our daughter's future. Now, finally, I had both. Mrs. Morrison, a reporter called out, "How does it feel to know that your in-laws murdered your husband?" I looked down at Lily, who was holding my hand tightly, her face serious but no longer afraid. She had heard all the testimony, understood what her grandfather had done to her father. She knew the truth now, terrible as it was. It feels like justice, I said finally. It feels like David can finally rest in peace, knowing that the truth came out and his daughter is safe. The criminal trial was over, but our civil case was still pending. The Morrison family owed us everything: the house, compensation for David's stolen possessions, damages for the emotional trauma, restitution for the fraud they had committed. And now, with their criminal convictions, that civil case was essentially guaranteed to succeed. But more importantly, Lily and I were finally free. Free from the lies, free from the manipulation, free from the family that had destroyed everything we loved for money. We could finally start building a real life together, founded on truth instead of deception. The nightmare was over. Now we could begin to heal. The aftermath of the criminal convictions brought a strange mixture of vindication and emptiness that I hadn't expected. For 2 years, my entire life had revolved around seeking justice for David's murder and fighting for Lily's future. Now, sitting in the civil court settlement conference 6 weeks after William's sentencing, I was about to receive everything I had fought for, and somehow it felt insufficient compensation for what we had lost. The Morrison estate has agreed to the following terms, announced Judge Margaret Chin, who was presiding over the settlement negotiations. Transfer of the family home at 428 Elm Street to Rebecca Morrison, free and clear. Payment of $340,000 in compensatory damages. Transfer of one investment property valued at $280,000. Establishment of a $150,000 trust fund for Lily Morrison's education, managed by an independent trustee. I looked across the conference table at the lawyers representing what remained of the Morrison estate. With William, Nathan, and Sarah all in prison, the family's assets were being liquidated under court supervision to pay restitution to their victims, and it turned out there were more victims than we had initially known. Mrs. Morrison, Judge Chin continued, this settlement represents full satisfaction of your civil claims against the Morrison family. The total value of compensation is approximately $770,000, plus the family home. Are these terms acceptable to you? $770,000. The price the court had placed on my husband's life, my daughter's trauma, and 2 years of homelessness and legal battles. It seemed simultaneously like an enormous sum and like nothing at all. Yes, Your Honor, I said. The terms are acceptable. The signing took less than 20 minutes. Decades of Morrison family wealth, accumulated through murder and fraud, was redistributed to the people they had wronged. Besides Lily and me, there were 3 other victim families who received settlements, relatives of William's murder victims who had been defrauded in similar ways over the years. Torres handed me the keys to 428 Elm Street as we left the courthouse. The same keys Nathan had dangled so cruelly that night in the snow, now legally mine along with everything else William Morrison had tried to steal. What are you going to do with the house? Torres asked as we stood on the courthouse steps. I looked at the key ring in my palm, thinking about all the memories contained within those walls. David's childhood bedroom where he had dreamed of becoming a teacher like his father. The kitchen where Margaret Morrison had taught me to make Lily's favorite cookies, never knowing her husband was planning to kill her. The living room where William had played grandfather to Lily, reading her bedtime stories while secretly calculating how much money her father's death would bring him. I'm not sure yet, I said honestly. I think I need to see it first. to decide if it can ever feel like home again, or if it will always feel like a crime scene. Lily had been staying with my sister Jennifer in California during the final weeks of the trial, sparing her from the most gruesome testimony about her father's murder. I drove to the house alone that evening, using the key for the first time since the night we had been locked out. The house was exactly as the Morrison family had left it when they were arrested. Nathan and Sarah's belongings were still scattered throughout the rooms, family photos on the mantelpiece, children's toys in the living room, Sarah's expensive kitchen appliances still plugged in and ready to use. It was like walking through a museum exhibit of a life interrupted by justice. I walked through each room slowly, remembering different versions of this space. David's childhood home, where he had brought me as his new bride. The place where we had brought Lily home from the hospital, where she had taken her first steps and spoken her first words. The house I had bankrupted myself to save, believing I was preserving my daughter's heritage. In the master bedroom, I found evidence that Nathan and Sarah had been living in complete denial about their situation. Sarah's calendar still showed appointments scheduled for months into the future, hair salon visits, parent-teacher conferences, dinner parties. There were vacation brochures on the dresser for a European cruise they had planned for the spring, apparently convinced they would avoid prosecution. But it was in William's old study that I found the most disturbing evidence of how deep the deception had run. Hidden behind a false panel in his desk, the police had missed a second journal, older and more detailed than the one they had used as evidence in the trial. This journal went back 25 years, documenting not just William's murders but his entire philosophy of family manipulation and control. He had written extensively about his techniques for exploiting grief and dependency, for timing financial requests to maximize compliance, for identifying which family members could be trusted with partial knowledge and which needed to be completely deceived. One entry, dated shortly after David and I were married, chilled me to the bone. Rebecca shows promise as long-term asset. Naturally deferential, eager to please, isolated from birth family. David's attachment ensures compliance. Recommend gradual conditioning for maximum exploitation potential. Key, maintain appearance of benevolent patriarchal protection while systematically eroding independence and financial security. I had been a target from the very beginning. William had spent 7 years systematically conditioning me to depend on the Morrison family's approval and support, carefully eroding my confidence and independence so that when David died, I would be completely vulnerable to their manipulation. Another entry, written just weeks before David's cancer diagnosis, was even more horrifying. David's insurance policy increased to $200,000 creates optimal conditions for intervention. Cancer diagnosis provides perfect cover. Rebecca's nursing background will prevent suspicion of medical manipulation. Timeline estimate, 18 to 24 months of treatment followed by strategic acceleration. William had been planning David's murder for months before the cancer was even discovered. The diagnosis hadn't been an opportunity, it had been the trigger for a plan that was already in motion. I sat in that study for hours, reading through 25 years of calculated evil, understanding for the first time how thoroughly we had all been manipulated. William hadn't just murdered his family members, he had spent years psychologically conditioning them to trust him, to depend on him, to never question his guidance or authority. But the final entry in the journal, dated just 3 days before our eviction, revealed something that changed how I understood everything that had happened. Rebecca's legal consultation with Torres confirms worst fears. Evidence compilation suggests systematic investigation. Nathan's panic creating liability. May require acceleration of permanent solution timeline. Alternative, negotiate settlement through intimidation. If unsuccessful, implement final protocol within 72 hours. William had known about our lawsuit before we filed it. Someone had told him I was consulting with a lawyer, had warned him that I was gathering evidence against the family. And that someone could only have been Torres himself. I called Torres immediately, confronting him with what I had discovered. Michael, I found another journal in William's study. He knew about our lawsuit before we filed it. He knew I was gathering evidence. The only way he could have known that was if you told him. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Torres spoke, his voice different than I had ever heard it before, cold and calculating. Rebecca, what you found doesn't prove anything. William Morrison was a paranoid man in the final stages of his criminal enterprise. Of course he was suspicious of everyone. He wrote that someone told him I was consulting with a lawyer. He wrote that Nathan was panicking because they knew about our evidence compilation. Michael, did you tell William Morrison about our case? Another pause. Rebecca, you need to be very careful about making accusations you can't prove. You've received a substantial settlement. You have your daughter's future secured. I'd hate to see you jeopardize that with unfounded conspiracy theories. The threat was unmistakable. Torres was warning me to stay quiet about his role in tipping off William Morrison. But why would my own lawyer have warned the people I was suing against? I hung up and immediately called Detective Rodriguez, telling her about the second journal and Torres's suspicious response to my questions. Rebecca, we've been investigating Torres for the past month, she said. Financial records show he received 3 payments of $25,000 each from William Morrison over the past year. We believe he was feeding information to the Morrison family from the beginning, helping them prepare their defense strategies. But he helped us win the case. He got us the settlement. Because once the murder charges were filed, he had no choice. If he had continued to sabotage your case after we uncovered the criminal conspiracy, it would have exposed his own involvement. He had to let you win to avoid prosecution himself. The betrayal was staggering. My own lawyer, the man I had trusted to fight for justice, had been working for the Morrison family from the very beginning. He had taken their money to spy on my legal strategy, to warn them about evidence I was gathering, to help them prepare defenses against my claims. Rodriguez, if Torres was working for them all along, does that mean? It means Torres knew about the murders and did nothing to stop them. It means he helped cover up multiple homicides for money. And Rebecca, it means William Morrison's plan to kill you and Lily might have succeeded if the police investigation hadn't moved so quickly. The scope of the conspiracy was even larger than I had imagined. Not just a family of murderers, but a corrupt lawyer helping them cover their tracks and target their victims. Torres hadn't just betrayed my trust, he had been complicit in the plan to murder my daughter and me. But even that revelation couldn't diminish what we had ultimately achieved. William Morrison was going to die in prison. Nathan and Sarah were facing decades behind bars. The truth about David's murder was public record. And Lily would grow up knowing that justice had been served for her father's death. Standing in that house where so much evil had been planned and executed, holding the deed that proved it was finally, legally mine, I made a decision about our future. This house would never be our home again. Too much blood had been spilled within these walls, too many lies had been told in these rooms. But it could become something else, something that honored David's memory and helped other families avoid the manipulation and fraud that had destroyed ours. I would sell the house and use the money to establish a foundation in David's name, providing legal assistance to families dealing with financial fraud and abuse. The Morrison family's blood money would be transformed into protection for future victims. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about preventing the same crimes from happening to others. And that work was just beginning. The choice between vengeance and mercy came to me in the most unexpected place, the prison visiting room where I sat across from William Morrison for the first and last time, 6 months after his conviction. I hadn't planned to visit him. I hadn't wanted to see the man who had murdered my husband and planned to kill my daughter. But something Torres had said during his own arrest had haunted me for weeks. "You think William Morrison is the only monster in this story," Torres had sneered as federal agents led him away in handcuffs. "You have no idea what kind of man your precious husband really was. Ask William about the real reason David had to die. Ask him about what David discovered." I tried to dismiss Torres's words as the desperate lies of a corrupt lawyer facing prison time. But they lodged in my mind like splinters, creating doubt where I thought I had found closure. What if there was more to David's murder than simple greed? What if there were secrets about my husband that I had never known? So I made the drive to Cheshire Correctional Institution on a gray October morning, Lily safely at school, my hands shaking as I submitted to the security procedures that would allow me to face my husband's killer. William Morrison looked like a broken man. The confident patriarch who had manipulated our family for decades was gone, replaced by a frail 78-year-old in an orange jumpsuit, his hands trembling with what I suspected was early-stage Parkinson's disease. When he saw me enter the visiting room, his face crumpled with what appeared to be genuine remorse. "Rebecca," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think you'd ever come." I sat across from him, separated by scratched plexiglass, picking up the phone that would allow us to talk. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "What do you say to the man who murdered your husband while pretending to comfort you in your grief?" "Torres said something before his arrest," I finally said. "He said there was more to David's death than money. He said David had discovered something that made him dangerous to you. I need to know if that's true." William's eyes filled with tears. "Rebecca, there are things about David, things about our family, that you're better off not knowing. David is gone. Nothing I tell you will bring him back. Let the dead rest." "No." My voice was sharper than I intended. "I've lived with lies for too long. If David discovered something about your murders, if that's why you killed him, I have a right to know. Lily has a right to know why her father really died." William was quiet for so long I thought he might refuse to answer. Then he spoke, his voice heavy with decades of guilt. "David found Margaret's real medical records," he said finally. "After she died, he was helping me sort through her papers when he discovered I'd been lying about her heart condition. Margaret never had heart problems, Rebecca. She was healthy as a horse. But the official cause of death was cardiac arrest from a digitalis overdose." My blood ran cold. "David knew you murdered his mother?" "He knew something was wrong. He started asking questions, demanding explanations. I tried to convince him that the doctors had made a mistake, that Margaret's medical records were confused with someone else's. But David was persistent. He started researching digitalis poisoning, comparing Margaret's symptoms to the textbook descriptions." William wiped his eyes with his sleeve, a pathetic gesture that didn't evoke any sympathy from me. Then he started looking into Robert's death. He pulled Robert's medical records, talked to the nurses who had treated him, reviewed the autopsy report. David was a smart man, Rebecca. Once he started investigating, it didn't take him long to piece together what had really happened. "So you killed him to silence him?" "I killed him because he threatened to go to the police. David came to me 3 weeks before he died and told me he had evidence that Robert and Margaret had been murdered. He said he was going to Detective Rodriguez with everything he had discovered. He gave me 48 hours to confess myself, or he would turn me in." The visiting room suddenly felt airless. David had known his father was a serial killer, and had given him the chance to confess voluntarily before involving the police. Even facing the truth about his family's monstrous crimes, David had tried to handle the situation with dignity and mercy. "But instead of confessing, you murdered him too." William nodded, no longer trying to hide his tears. "I couldn't go to prison, Rebecca. I was 76 years old. A life sentence would have meant dying behind bars. I convinced myself that David's cancer would kill him anyway, that I was just accelerating the inevitable. You murdered your own son rather than face the consequences of murdering your wife and your other son." "Yes." The word was barely audible. "And Rebecca, there's something else. Something David made me promise before I killed him." I gripped the phone tighter, not sure I wanted to hear whatever confession was coming next. "David made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would make sure you and Lily were taken care of. He made me swear that you would inherit the house, that Lily would have financial security. Even knowing what I was, even knowing I was planning to kill him, David was worried about you and Lily being left alone." The irony was devastating. David had extracted a promise from his murderer to protect his wife and daughter, not knowing that his father was already planning to kill us too once David was dead. David loved you so much, Rebecca. In those final days, when he knew what was going to happen to him, all he could talk about was making sure you and Lily would be okay. He made me write out a will leaving everything to you. He made me sign papers guaranteeing your financial security. He died believing I would honor those promises. I thought about the succession document William had signed, promising that the house would be mine. David had essentially forced his father to create that legal protection, even while the same man was planning his murder. But you didn't honor those promises. You threw us out in the snow and stole everything David left us. William's face contorted with fresh grief. Nathan convinced me that you were becoming a liability, that you were asking too many questions about the family finances. Sarah said you were getting suspicious about David's death. They convinced me that you needed to be managed before you discovered the truth on your own. Managed? You mean murdered? I was weak, Rebecca. I was terrified of being caught. When Nathan and Sarah started pressuring me to do something about you and Lily, I gave in to that fear instead of honoring the promises I'd made to David. I sat in silence, absorbing the full scope of what William had confessed. David had died knowing his father was a serial killer, but had spent his final days trying to protect his wife and daughter from that same killer. He had extracted promises and created legal documents, trying to build safeguards for our future even while facing his own murder. There's one more thing, William said. David recorded a video message for Lily. On his phone. He hid it in a place he knew I'd never think to look. It's still there, in the house. He wanted her to have it when she was old enough to understand what really happened to him. Where is it? In his childhood bedroom, inside the old guitar case in the closet. He used his phone to record a message for Lily, explaining everything, about my crimes, about his investigation, about how much he loved her and you. He wanted her to know that he died protecting the truth, not hiding from it. I felt tears streaming down my face for the first time since entering that visiting room. David had left us a message, a final gift from beyond the grave. After all the lies and manipulation and murder, there was one last piece of truth waiting for us. William, I said, my voice steadying, I need you to understand something. I'm not here because I forgive you. I'm not here because I feel sorry for you. I'm here because David would have wanted me to hear the truth, no matter how painful it was. I know. You took everything from us. You murdered the man I loved, you traumatized my daughter, you stole our home and our security. You planned to kill us to cover up your other crimes. There is no forgiveness for that. William nodded, accepting my condemnation without argument. But, I continued, I'm not going to let your evil consume the rest of my life. I'm not going to spend the next 40 years carrying the poison of hatred in my heart. David died protecting the truth, and I'm going to honor that by building something good from this wreckage. I stood to leave, then turned back for one final question. Do you want to know what I'm going to do with the money from selling the house? William looked up at me with empty eyes. I'm going to establish a foundation that provides legal aid to families dealing with financial fraud and elder abuse. I'm going to make sure other people have the resources to fight back when their own family members try to steal from them and manipulate them. I paused. I'm going to turn your blood money into protection for future victims. That's David's real legacy, not the money you stole, but the justice we're going to provide for other families. I left the prison that day with a strange sense of peace. Not forgiveness, I would never forgive William Morrison for what he had done. But acceptance. Acceptance that evil existed, that people could choose greed over love, that families could be sources of danger rather than safety. But also acceptance that I had the power to choose differently. To choose mercy over vengeance, healing over hatred, protection over revenge. David's final gift was waiting for us at home, hidden in his childhood room. But his greater gift was the example he had set, facing impossible circumstances with courage and dignity, protecting the people he loved even at the cost of his own life. That was the lesson I wanted to teach Lily. Not that the world was safe or fair, but that we could choose to make it safer and more fair for others. That was how we would honor her father's memory, not by seeking endless revenge, but by preventing other families from experiencing what we had survived. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about transformation. And our transformation was just beginning. 3 years after that final conversation with William Morrison, I stood in the living room of what had once been the Morrison family home, watching the last moving truck pull away from the curb. The house looked different now, brighter, warmer, filled with the sounds of children playing and mothers finding their strength again. The David Morrison Foundation had purchased the property from me at market value, then converted it into a residential facility for families escaping financial abuse and domestic violence. Where William had once planned murders over family dinners, women now attended legal workshops and financial literacy classes. Where Nathan and Sarah had counted their blood money, children did homework at kitchen tables while their mothers rebuilt their lives. "Mom, look what I found," Lily called from the garden, holding up something that glinted in the afternoon sun. She was 15 now, tall and confident, with David's gentle eyes but a strength that was entirely her own. She'd grown up knowing the truth about her father's death, understanding that heroes sometimes die protecting the people they love. I walked over to see what she discovered, and my breath caught. It was David's class ring from college, the one he'd lost in the garden years ago while planting the apple tree that still grew strong against the back fence. The ring was tarnished but intact, a small piece of him returning to us just as we were saying goodbye to this place forever. "He would have liked what we did with the house," Lily said, slipping the ring onto her thumb where it hung loose but secure. "Turning something that caused so much pain into a place that helps people heal." She was right. The foundation had helped over 200 families in 3 years, providing legal representation, temporary housing, and financial counseling to people being victimized by relatives who exploited family bonds for profit. We'd expanded to 3 locations across Connecticut, with plans for facilities in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. The funding came from multiple sources now: the sale of William's real estate portfolio, donations from supporters who followed our story, grants from organizations fighting elder abuse and domestic violence. But the seed money had come from the Morrison family's blood money, transformed into something David would have been proud of. "Mrs. Morrison?" A voice called from the front porch. I turned to see Maria Santos, one of our current residents, holding her 6-year-old daughter's hand. Maria had fled an abusive marriage where her husband had systematically stolen her inheritance and destroyed her credit, leaving her unable to rent an apartment or support her child. "The legal aid meeting went really well," Maria said, her face glowing with hope I remembered from my own journey toward justice. "Mr. Peterson thinks we can recover most of the money my husband hid, and he's going to help me file for full custody. I should be able to move into my own apartment next month." Watching Maria's transformation over the past 4 months had been like watching myself heal and fast forward. She'd arrived broken and terrified, convinced she was stupid for trusting someone who had betrayed her so completely. Now she was preparing to start college in the fall, planning to study social work so she could help other women escape similar situations. "That's wonderful news," I said, hugging her. "You've worked so hard for this." "I never could have done it without this place," Maria replied. "Without people who understood what it felt like to be betrayed by your own family. You saved my daughter and me, Mrs. Morrison. You gave us a future." As I watched Maria walk back toward the house with her daughter, I thought about the ripple effects of justice. David's death had seemed senseless, a tragedy that served no purpose except to satisfy one man's greed. But from that tragedy had grown something larger: a network of protection for vulnerable families, a system of support for people learning to rebuild their lives after betrayal. The video message David had left for Lily was framed now in our new apartment, his final words to his daughter displayed where she could see them every morning. He'd recorded it the night before he died, sitting in his childhood bedroom, knowing William would kill him but determined to leave Lily with the truth about who he really was. "My beautiful daughter," the message began, "if you're watching this, then something has happened to me, and you need to know that whatever it wasn't your fault or your mother's fault. Some people choose evil over love, but that doesn't mean love loses. Love wins by creating more love, by protecting other people, by refusing to let evil have the final word." He'd talked about his investigation into William's crimes, about his decision to confront his father rather than go straight to the police, about his belief that even murderers deserved a chance to confess and make amends. He'd talked about his love for Lily and me, about his hopes for our future, about his certainty that we would not only survive his loss but would find ways to help others survive theirs. "Your grandfather is a sick man who chose money over family," David had said in the recording. "But you, Lily, you're going to choose love over money, truth over comfort, justice over revenge. You're going to be the best of both your parents, and you're going to make the world safer for other little girls whose families fail them." Lily had watched that video dozens of times over the years, drawing strength from her father's final words whenever the weight of our story felt too heavy to bear. She'd started a peer counseling program at her high school for students dealing with family trauma, and was planning to study law in college with a focus on victims' rights advocacy. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been years of therapy, months of financial stress while the civil case was resolved, weeks of media attention that made us feel exposed and vulnerable. There had been nights when I'd questioned whether fighting for justice was worth the cost, days when I'd wondered if forgiveness might have been simpler than the long, difficult work of healing. But standing in that garden on a warm September afternoon, watching Lily examine her father's recovered ring while Maria's daughter played nearby with other children who were learning that home could be a safe place, I knew we had chosen correctly. William Morrison died in prison 2 years after our final conversation, alone and unmourned except by the handful of former students who still believed in the fiction of the kind teacher rather than the reality of the serial killer. Nathan was eligible for parole in 23 years, though the parole board would have to weigh his cooperation with ongoing investigations against the magnitude of his crimes. Sarah would be released in 12 years, by which time she would be nearly 60, starting over with nothing but the knowledge of what her greed had cost her family. Torres received 15 years for conspiracy and obstruction of justice, disbarred and banned from ever practicing law again. His betrayal had stung deeply at the time, but in retrospect, his corruption had helped us in unexpected ways. By warning William about our investigation, Torres had forced the Morrison family to act more recklessly, creating the evidence trail that ultimately led to their convictions. As Lily and I walked through the house one final time before leaving forever, I thought about the strange journey that had brought us to this point. We'd started as victims, a widow and her daughter, manipulated and discarded by the people who should have protected us. We'd become survivors, fighting back against systematic fraud and murder. And finally, we become something more, advocates, protectors, creators of safety for others who found themselves where we had once been. The rain started as we drove away from Elm Street for the last time, but it didn't feel ominous anymore. It felt cleansing, washing away the last remnants of who we used to be and preparing the ground for who we were still becoming. Do you think Dad would be proud of us? Lily asked as we stopped at a red light, the Morrison house disappearing in the rearview mirror. I thought about David's final video message, about his belief that love could transform even the worst tragedies into sources of healing for others. I thought about the 200 families we'd helped, the children who would grow up safer because of the advocacy programs we'd funded, the legal precedents we'd helped establish that would make it easier for future victims to find justice. I think he'd be amazed by who you've become, I said, squeezing her hand. And I think he'd be proud that his death wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of a better one. The light turned green, and we drove toward our new life, leaving behind the house where so much evil had been planned and so much healing had begun. We were no longer victims of the Morrison family's crimes. We were not defined by what had been done to us, but by what we had chosen to do with the strength we'd found in surviving it. Love had won, just as David had promised it would. Not by pretending evil didn't exist, but by transforming it into something that served justice, protection, and hope. That was his true legacy, not the money or the house or the legal victories, but the proof that even the worst betrayals could become the foundation for something beautiful. The rain continued to fall as we drove toward home, but this time, no one was left outside in the cold. This time, everyone had a place to go, and people who would fight to make sure they got there safely. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.